Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Marta Kozlowska, Development Director at the Energy Institute. For those of you who don't know the Energy Institute, we're an independent network of professionals covering the whole energy system. And our ambition is for energy to be better understood, managed, and valued. And working with our members, we help the industry to tackle urgent challenges by bringing together expertise and insights, such as today's webinar. So we've got two speakers today, Damian Waters from HKA and Anna Mills from DLA Piper. As you know, HKA is an independent provider of consulting and expert advisory services, and DLA Piper is a global law firm with lawyers and offices in 40 countries. Damian and Anna will discuss practical steps for mitigating risk and how to keep energy projects on track as we emerge from the pandemic. We want to make sure that this is an interactive session, so please do ask questions. And you can do this by just using the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And please do select everyone from the drop-down menu and type in your question. We will share the slides from this session afterwards, as well as the recording with all the delegates. And finally, as the webinar finishes, there will be a short questionnaire popping up. So do please fill it in. We very much value your feedback. Anna, Damian, over to you.
Thank you, Marta, and good afternoon, everybody. As Marta said, my name is Anna Mills. I'm a partner with DLA Piper in the London office, sitting within the litigation and arbitration team, but specialising in construction engineering disputes primarily, and particularly within the energy space, and more often than not in renewables and wind. And although I sit within a dispute resolution group, I actually do a lot of risk mitigation and advice during the operational phase of a project in an attempt to prevent people from ending up in a dispute scenario. And I'm delighted today to be speaking alongside Damian. Damian, over to you.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, my name is Damian Waters. I'm a partner in HKA based in the UK. My CV says I've got 30 years experience, but I was working it out this morning that I've actually got 36 years experience in the industry. So I've been in the industry a long time now, certainly longer than Anna has. Yeah, my sort of specialism is international projects, large international M&E, oil and gas, infrastructure, marine, offshore projects, and I assist clients in evaluating claims for owners and contractors. And I also represent parties in DAB and adjudication proceedings as well, mainly in the international field. And I also turn my hand to the odd expert appointment now and again, mainly on quantum matters, but I'm also fairly familiar with delay as well. Anyway, it's really nice to present to you today. I'll share the slides now. Fingers crossed it will work.
It's the moment of truth.
And then we can get started.
Lovely. So what we've done for the purposes of today's session is prepared a fictional case study. And of course, it reflects aspects of matters that both I and Damian have assisted with. But it isn't intended to reflect reality, so please bear that in mind. The project that we're going to look at, Damian, perhaps if you move on a couple of slides, set out some key points on this slide. So it's an onshore wind farm in Northern Europe. The contract based on FIDIC Yellow Book 1999, and it is a project financed project. The owner is a joint venture, not uncommon, consisting of two large organisations involved in wind farms all over the world. There's known as Engineer, and that's a related party. The contractor is a global contractor and supplier of turbines, and the turbines parts are being manufactured across different European locations and China and transported to the site. I'm going to mention a couple of facts that we may not cover in detail, but that might spark questions, so bear that in mind. The WTGs are location specific and the blades are specific to the foundations, and there's a limited number of suppliers who are capable of manufacturing these particular turbine parts. And so having set that scene, what we now intend to do is look at 4 different scenarios. And while we may answer or deal with those scenarios from the perspective of an owner or a contractor, it's important to say now that both Damian and I advise owners and contractors. And so if there appears to be any bias one way or the other, it's either inadvertent or it's deliberate for the purposes of making a point that's set out in that scenario. So over to you, Damian.
Okay, this is the scenario 1. It's March 2020. The project is already in significant delay due to a number of factors which it has been unable to remedy. Under the terms of the contract, the owner has a right to terminate. COVID has just been discovered in China, but it is not causing an impact to the project as yet. So the question that we're asking or debating is, what can the owner do to protect its position, and what should it consider with respect to its finance agreements? So I'd just like to hand back to Anna, and she can start the discussion on this particular point.
Thanks, Damian. There is a really important reason for posing this scenario, and that's because to a certain extent COVID has become all-consuming, and it's provided many contractors with the perfect excuse to ignore the distress that a project might have been suffering before the pandemic emerged. It's suddenly all that everyone can talk about, and it's suddenly to remind you that it's really important at every single stage of a project to understand whether your project is in delay. If so, why is it in delay? And by how much is it delayed? And the reason being is that it's very easy to be caught out otherwise when responding to a claim for time and money, or when an intervening event such as COVID suddenly takes centre stage. And Damian, I think you were going to talk a bit about the programme.
Yeah, that's right, Anna. I mean, I think it's really important to have an accepted, decent baseline programme in this situation, prepared in the appropriate software, of course, and that it's regularly updated in accordance with the contract. It's important that the owner, holds the contract to the commitments that are set out in the contract, because often I find, particularly on FIDIC contracts, that you will have quite detailed reporting provisions that have been introduced by the particular conditions of the contract. But unfortunately, the owners don't enforce them in the way that they should. So, it's a matter of obviously making sure that the contractors do what is said in the contract. You also need the right team of advisors, undoubtedly, in this situation, and a bit of investment up front in the right team can be worth its weight in gold further on. Certainly from our perspective, we often think that clients may think that lawyers and experts are only needed when the project's gone badly wrong. But actually, in a situation like this where COVID was starting to hit, then we were able to add value on live projects, knowing from our experience, where this was likely to go, and to keep things on the straight and narrow. Certainly from a records perspective, maybe the situation that the contract doesn't have good records, or maybe he does, but he doesn't provide the owner with all of those records at the right time, or keeps them back for himself for his own purposes later on. So, should the owner rely on the information provided to him by the contractor? My advice would be no. I think it's important to have a comprehensive and independent understanding of the status of the project prior to the impact of COVID. I don't think you can necessarily rely on what the contractor is telling you from an owner's perspective. And certainly over the last year or so, we've been asked to interrogate a number of projects pre-COVID, and we would of course review the baseline programme from a technical and practical perspective, which may involve preparations of new baseline programmes or improving the contractor's baseline. So it's a useful tool for delay analysis purposes. That would be a good starting point. But the next stage will be to establish an as-built programme immediately prior to COVID-19. This sounds very easy in theory, but difficult in practice because of the records or lack of records that we often face. And if we're just relying on contractors' programmes and their updates, then often the durations of progress can be overstated for cash flow purposes or just to mask delays. So you need to look at that information with a critical eye and determine from an owner's perspective, where does the project actually sit at that point? Clearly tensions exist between the contractor and the owner, and sometimes we can cut through that with an independent view of the status of the project, because I think from an owner's perspective, they're concerned that the contractor may well be seeking to mask some of these pre-COVID delays, particularly as the COVID pandemic was starting to affect the project.
I completely agree with you. And one example that we've done on a project such as this is to actually, as you say, Damian, build with the help of an expert a shadow program to track the contractor's program, particularly where, for example, the contractor's program might not have been prepared in appropriate software or might not have been prepared correctly, and so it's very difficult to interrogate. The advantages of creating a shadow program is obviously that you can then impact it yourself with ongoing delays, so that the owner has a proper understanding of the status of the works at any particular time and can forecast accurately the time for completion, which is helpful obviously for its own purposes. It's also particularly helpful when you've got a project financed project, because the lenders are going to want to know what the future holds for them, and they're not going to accept a wishy-washy answer. They need to know that actually you've put some commitment in and you've actually established what the answer is. Particularly where in this sort of example, the delay has got so significant that actually parties are starting to consider, at least behind closed doors, whether or not there's a termination right and whether or not they should exercise it. You would also, of course, need to have that if you were considering swapping horses. So to have as a foundation or the basis for any discussions with any potential contractors that you might be thinking to bring in, either to supplement or replace the contractor that's already there. So it really can't be underestimated, and there'll be different levels of sophistication within owner organisations as to how much they're capable of interrogating a programme and how much they will understand it. And so certainly I've been in situations where they've really appreciated somebody coming in and holding their hand and helping them with that. I'm also going to bang the same drum that Damian's been banging about records. I say it all the time. And generally speaking, the contractors that I work with are very, very good at doing it because they know that it'll help them, and that's what they need to establish a right to time and money. It's not always the same on the owner's side of things. And often we will work with a client, whether it's a contractor or an owner, to sort of create an idea of the kinds of documents or progress reports that they'll need to collate, and that's partly as set out in the contract, and also partly as a measure of a good habit or good administration, let's say. And I think it's important for this sort of project to consider how you're going to obtain that information, because if you are building a medium-sized residential development in London, let's say, it might be quite easy to send a team of people around to wander around and take photographs. It's a very, very different thing when you have a huge, disparate onshore wind farm, perhaps in a rather hostile location. That can be very, very impractical. So it can take more than a day to drive around the site, and that's of course assuming that your civils have progressed sufficiently to allow for a vehicle to do that, and also that there's no inclement weather that's going to get in your way. So both Damian and I have got experience of working with clients to look at what's most appropriate in those circumstances. And of course, now we see many people using drones to obtain footage that might otherwise be very difficult, time-consuming and expensive to get. And again, I'm going to touch on another aspect of this scenario, which is this entitlement to terminate. So here the delay is so bad pre-COVID that it's triggered a right to terminate. And again, this isn't to talk about FIDIC, but be aware of the fact that those sorts of rights can actually be triggered relatively easy under a FIDIC contract. And what we wanted to highlight here is the risk associated with your financing arrangements, and a reminder just to always check that suite of documents before you take any major decisions or launch a particular course of action. Because ordinarily in a private project, it might seem fairly anodyne to write a letter to a contractor saying, hey, get on with this. It's so bad that we actually have a right to terminate. In a project finance project, you have to be very careful of doing that, because simply having a right to terminate can amount to an event of default under the financing arrangement, which you really might not want in circumstances where your project is already in distress. particularly, let's say, if it's an equity first, debt later project and you're waiting for your first draw. So just a reminder that in a project finance scenario, you have to continually go back to those documents, think about the lenders, get their buy-in.
No, totally agree, Anna. I mean, the this pragmatism that's required, particularly on wind farm projects, just because of the resource issue that we have in the industry at the moment, and also, the supply chain and the engineering is very complex. So owners are going to be very reluctant to push the termination button if they don't have alternative contractors on the hook with the required skill sets available to step in and mitigate the delays. The actual reality that we face at the moment is that, as an industry, is that resources are extremely tight. And if you decided to terminate and then went elsewhere to secure turbines, blades, even generators, even civils contracts to some extent, you may struggle to do so. Certainly within the timescales that you would require for the finance agreement. So yeah, it's a key issue, I think. Another option you could think about is instructing the contractor to accelerate, which might seem quite galling from an owner's point of view if the contractor is already in culpable delay and therefore paying more money to accelerate, when you may say that really he should be mitigating his own delays rather than accelerating. That might be the view that you take, but ultimately it would come down to the benefits that you could secure from that acceleration, and if it was something that could be be worthwhile. It's a tricky one though, isn't it, acceleration, because you're trying to incentivize the contractor, and you may want to make the acceleration conditional upon achieving certain milestones or key dates, because often you can have an open-ended acceleration arrangement and then further events hit the project, and ultimately then the contractor will say, well, I still want to be paid for the acceleration that I've undertook, but the actual project hasn't had any benefit from that because of subsequent events. So certainly you would need to be very careful if you were intending to accelerate a contractor, particularly I think in the current situation with COVID, because you have a situation where the project delivery dates are still uncertain. So you could invest quite a lot of money and then not really get the result that you're seeking. Another aspect of the acceleration argument would be, from the owner's perspective, to have a really clear understanding of where you stand on the project in terms of progress, program logic, the interfaces between the various packages, because ultimately you can accelerate one element of the works, but if you're not accelerating other aspects, then the benefit may not be materialized in the end of the day for the overall benefit of the project. So yeah, absolutely crucial. Another aspect which is linked to acceleration, I've been dealing with quite a lot recently, is constructive acceleration arguments, because you can imagine that because of COVID and pre-COVID, there has been a reluctance, I think, from owners to award extensions of time certainly tenuously. So the contractors are starting to run arguments to say, well, we're under threat of liquidated damages. We haven't received the extension of time that we consider we're due, and therefore we will be increasing our resources not to mitigate but to accelerate. And I think we both know that constructive acceleration arguments are quite tricky under English law because there isn't a legal precedence for them, but the courts have got close a couple of times to accepting the principle. So certainly it's certainly a concern to make sure that your correspondence, the way that you write, how you write to contractors, is not perceived as acceleration. If you intend to accelerate, you need to make sure that you get your lawyers on board to draft something which is robust.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and also I think the key rule is don't panic, because I think sometimes when you get into a situation of distress, there's part of you that can think, well, we'll just throw ordinary contract administration out of the window and we'll just deal with this disaster that's in front of us. And so actually the letters stop getting written, the notices to correct, let's say it's FIDIC here, stop getting sent out, because suddenly there's a bigger fish to fry. And so my advice would be, make sure that you don't lose sight of that. There still needs to be resource dedicated to administering the contract properly and ensuring that the record is clear. That doesn't mean that you can't be having commercial discussions separately. They're not to be, it's not mutually exclusive, so they should be done in parallel, and we'll perhaps come on to that a bit more as we continue through the seminar. I think we can probably go to scenario 2 now.
Yes, okay. Okay, we're now on to scenario 2, and COVID is starting to impact. So we've skipped forward 6 months, and COVID is in full flow now, really impacting on the contractor. The contractor has cash flow difficulties as well, and informs the owner that it has overcommitted on the blades, which are needed on projects all over the world, and it needs the owner to release cash if it wants to secure delivery. So there's a bit of a veil threat there from the contractor. You know, can the parties keep the projects on track? And if so, how are they going to be able to do that in this situation? Quite a challenging situation, Anna, to be fair.
Very challenging situation, but one that we wanted to talk about because while it might shock some of you who are listening to this seminar, regardless of the rights or wrongs of it, it was the commercial reality faced by clients on a project of mine, and it was a problem that required a solution. So in these circumstances, at the current stage of that particular project, bringing a claim wouldn't have helped anybody. Falling out with each other wouldn't have helped everybody. Particularly, as Damian's already alluded to, in this market, there's a relatively small group of companies that are involved in this sort of project around the world. And so if you take them down, then effectively you may also be destroying other projects around the world or your ability to complete other projects. So the reason why we wanted to share this scenario and talk about it a bit is that to show that even the most unpalatable scenario, and one again that could be incredibly troubling for an owner, can be worked through and resolved. And certainly as we've seen COVID develop, we've seen contractors, owners and lenders alike all taking a much more collaborative and commercial approach to these sorts of issues, as opposed to just turning up their contract, which has probably been shoved in a drawer and not really looked at since, and figuring out what legal rights and remedies they have. They've thought, what are our commercial objectives and how do we get there? And then using the right advisors to help them develop something that's appropriate. So again, as I said previously, first to your lenders if the project's financed. Any solution will need to be blessed by them, and you will need their buy-in. The last thing that you want is to solve the problems with the contractor, but find out that your lenders have got very cold feet and actually want to pull out of the project. As I said, this is actually based on a real life scenario. And as a result of this sort of issue and many others, we actually assisted our client with a full and very complex PC contract in place, which included a partial waiver of COVID-19, which was quite tricky because it had to be assessed across a number of different jurisdictions. We worked very closely with the group of lenders to procure waivers in relation to potential events of default. We assisted the owner and the contractor with their negotiations to bring on an additional contractor in order to assist with the works and get the project back on track. We also helped procure additional resources for site and in the contract administration teams, because this has added, the burden of work really has increased in most cases. We had to develop a new quality control and assurance program, because the owner was now having to pay for, ultimately agreed, yes, okay, well, we want our blade, so we've got to find a solution here. So what ended up happening was that the cash would go out before these goods were actually delivered on site. And so there needed to be some revisions to the QC and QA process that was being followed. And there also had to be some quite significant changes to the security package as a swap for revising the payment schedules and the milestone payments, to ensure that there was sufficient additional bonding in place in the event that the contractor went bust, or the goods were defective, or they simply weren't delivered. Because it's not just the manufacture of these component parts, it's the haulage and the logistics of getting them from one location, often in a different country, to the site. So in that scenario, it was advice across about 6 different jurisdictions. And it really was a collaboration and a collective effort on the part of all parties involved, all lenders, the owner, the contractor, some subcontractors, where we were on the phone together day and night, because failing to deliver the project simply wasn't an option. And it was essential in this case to protect the contractor's liquidity in order to make sure that the project could go ahead. And of course, part of this deal, and it's something that we were harping on about a little bit, involved very, very careful analysis of the real programme, not the programme that had been submitted by the contractor, but what the actual situation was on site before COVID and during, and also the costs that had been incurred or that were starting to be incurred. And it involved advice on how to protect claims and ensure that consistent and proper contract administration was being done, despite the changes that were being negotiated alongside via the commercial channels, albeit with the assistance of lawyers.
No, I think that's correct, Hannah. I certainly I've been involved in something similar, not to that extent, but I guess the key to success would have been openness and honesty between the parties, because you could see that the owner may well be aggrieved about the veiled threat initially, but he's got to obviously keep the project on track and think about the big picture. The contractor genuinely has a problem, and the prospect of actually securing an alternative contractor would be slim. So I think both sides would need to be open and honest in those discussions. And I think the way it's worked for me in the past is where you explore a number of different scenarios as well. So you're looking at the likely outcomes, and you can only do that really if the owner and the contractor and the subcontractors, the supply chain overall, are prepared to be open and honest about the actual status of the project in all aspects, including, as you say, actual progress on site, design office, procurement, fabrication yards, etc. Where are we on the project? Genuinely, where are we, and what can we do? I think to assist that process, which is helpful if you've got an independent third party of some sort, whether that's legal or expert, maybe not truly independent, but someone who's providing a cold eyes, view of the status of the project, responsibility for delay, calculations of cost, forecasting as well, based on current progress, where are we likely to be? Let's not look at what we were planning in terms of resources and, and what are we achieving? Let's not look at what we're planning to achieve in terms of progress. What have we been achieving over the last 3 months? And therefore, bearing that in mind, when you're coming up with realistic timescales to completion, and you need the data to be able to do that. And that goes for both sides. You've got to be able to, I think the third party involvement as well might assist when you've got to reassure lenders, for example, so that they're confident that, the rearranged legal and contractual framework and the relationship changes will work and will be for the benefit of the project. And they might need reassurance from a third party to sort of secure their confidence in that regard. So from a contractor, from a contractor's point of view, he's still going to prepare robust claims, and therefore, that openness and transparency I think is important, and it would avoid also as well going through a lengthy dispute resolution process, which I guess you avoided on your project. Yes. Was a massive benefit, I would think.
Yeah, exactly. That was the key, really. Falling out would have just made it 10 times worse.
Maybe you would have more fees though, Anna, out of it. I don't know.
We might have done. We'd have been the only winners, I think. Okay, shall we move on to scenario 3?
Okay.
Right. So it's March 2021, not that far long gone. The contractor has submitted a global claim for the entire period of delay and associated cost. And the contractor is making its claim relying on the force majeure provisions in the contract. The owner's engineer has considered the claim and has rejected the claim out of hand. So the question that we're posing here is, what should the contractor and or employer be aware of, and what should the parties do next? And Damian, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, no, it's a common scenario, isn't it? Let's be honest. And what jumps out to me is, the owner's engineer rejects the claim out of hand. well, you may have good reasons for doing that if it's a global claim, and it may well not be suitably particularised. But where does that leave the contractor and the employer? You know, because the question we have here is, we've got a 1-year delay, and who is going to pay for that delay? And you know, we know, I think, in the wind farm sector, that margins are are tight on both sides, and you know, whoever has to carry a 1 year's delay to a project, it's going to erode into their margins significantly. You know, over the years, I've had quite a lot of involvement in oil and gas projects, and certainly until fairly recently, there's been quite a lot of margin in those projects, and parties have been able to negotiate their way out of these situations commercially. You know, with the struggle, but you know, they have got there. But my experience of the offshore onshore wind market is that margins are tight, and therefore this kind of situation, the employer and the contractor have got to be mindful that as the engineers rejected the claim out of hand, we could be heading to dispute. You know,
yeah.
You know, so it's that's the thing, really. I mean, it's a marshal of forces, I guess, to start with, on both sides, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think that's really helpful in terms of the context. We don't have a huge amount of time in this seminar, but just to rattle through some of the sort of particular legal niceties or details to consider as well. I think probably everybody listening to this will know that when you have a FIDIC contract, be really careful of the notice provisions, and that's if it's unamended. So you need to be super careful, because there may well have been even more nasties thrown in at the contract negotiation stage. But the reality is, if you don't get your claim in on time, then your claim for time and money will be time barred. And I think that's been particularly difficult for people during the pandemic, because when did COVID start? And where are you looking at when you're looking at where it started? Because it's come in waves, and it's appeared in different jurisdictions at different times, and it's disappeared and it's come back again, and it's really been quite tricky. And actually, one thing that I've come across or noticed is that many contractors will have submitted the equivalent of an early warning notice, which isn't in the 1999 form. And then they've thought, well, okay, I'm done. I've told the owner that there's COVID, and now I don't need to worry about it. That suffices, that's my notice. But actually, at that stage, you may not have been able to actually assess the impact to your project. And that is always a requirement. You'll have to look quite carefully at the wording of the contractual provisions to look at the extent to which you have to establish whether it's prevented performance completely, whether it just has to have impacted it. But you really need to give some careful thought to those types of provisions. And don't assume that one notice will do. You know, you might have to put in several, and those several notices may all have to be updated. You know, they may be interim in nature, and then you have to follow the time frame as dictated by the contract in terms of updating them. I think that's particularly so, as I said, when you're covering off various different jurisdictions, because in parts of Northern Europe, for example, really the impact of COVID-19 started to be felt around March 2020. In China, where some of the components, parts may have been manufactured, it was felt in January. And so you have to really have your finger on the pulse as contractor and owner in order to be able to put your best foot forward in terms of getting those claim notices in. And picking up on some of Damian's points, that the parties need to consider whether as I just mentioned, whether the events complained of actually had an effect. Because it's, as I said, it's just time and time again, they can't actually demonstrate, a contractor is struggling to demonstrate the impact. And even though you might have a really good in-house planner, that's also a time when you might want to just reach out and say, I need to do a quick and dirty analysis here. I don't need an as planned versus as built, but I need somebody to help me show the impact on a very complex project where there are, you know, the various different work streams running in parallel. Also, we specifically in this scenario have stated that the contractor is relying on a claim for force majeure. That's deliberate, just to make the point that as a contractor under FIDIC, it's very likely that you will only get time for a force majeure clause. And so it's important to consider all of the provisions of the contract, because there are several in there that give you time and money. And so don't just think COVID, act of God, force majeure, and look to clause 19. have a look at all of those provisions that are set out, and depending on the amendments that have been made to your FIDIC contract, they're not all neatly set out in clause 8. They're dotted around. So best practice is, in fact, to stick them all in nicely ordered in clause 8 at the outset. But if you haven't managed to achieve that, someone's going to have to do a bit of a rake through and find out what they are, so that you don't do yourself out of a good claim. Equally, as an employer or an owner, if a contractor has only submitted a claim for force majeure, then you need to make sure you know what remedies flow from that. And you might, for example, be able to avoid paying costs. Now, you might feel morally wrong, but that's unfortunately how our world works. If somebody has only submitted a claim under a particular provision in time, then the rest of their claims will be time barred. Quick note as well, I know the legal niceties are a bit dull, but both parties need to consider the obligation to mitigate. Again, depending on your project, the governing law, and what your contract says, that might be express or it might be implied, but you'll need to show that it's being complied with. So it's important to remember that the steps to be taken generally need to be reasonable, and they need to be by reference to the commercial context. But a contractor can't choose not to do something simply because it will cost money, like resequencing the works, for example. And of course, if you are taking steps to mitigate, make sure that you document them, because they will need to be included as part of any claim. While they're on documents, just a small warning, also be really careful not to create unhelpful ones. Again, in times like this, while we are promoting collaboration and communication and the commercial realities of our situation, it's also important to remember that you may well need to make a claim at a later stage, or you may well be on the receiving end of a claim at a later stage. Try to use privilege protection if it's available to you in your jurisdiction and with your governing law. And I think that is particularly important where there is a degree of collaboration, and so contractual lines can be a little bit blurred.
That makes absolute sense, Anna. I mean, it's a real minefield when you work on international projects regarding the force majeure and change in law provisions. And certainly at the beginning of COVID, I was heavily involved with an oil and gas contractor, looking at all of their contracts from a perspective of changing law and force majeure to see where we actually stood. Because the change in law provisions are not something that you really give so much consideration to until sort of COVID happened, and then suddenly those provisions become very important because, as you said, force majeure is likely to give you time only. Change in law may well entitle you to recover costs as well. But it's a complex situation, isn't it? There's going to be a debate probably about when a force majeure event started and when the force majeure event ended. Bearing in mind that you will have the project location, the project will be constructed in lots of different locations around the world. So, and the changing law requirements, when changing law happened, when legislation changes were made in different jurisdictions, what impact did they have? You've got to be on top of that. And certainly, you need the detailed records of that. And I think we've both worked on projects where we've been required by clients to keep global COVID trackers.
Yeah.
Where recording the laws, restrictions, regulations in place at any one time is okay. But what about going back? It's difficult to go back and find out precisely what was happening in China or in Singapore or in mainland Europe, unless you actually log it correctly at the time. Make sure that you've got a really good understanding of the impact of COVID from a force majeure change in law perspective, and then apply that knowledge to the facts of your case to see where that actually leaves you. Extremely challenging. But we have. Good
point, Damian. Really good point, because it's a nightmare from experience. I think we can all remember the time where the regulations were changing in certain countries on an almost daily basis. So if you were to log onto a website, you could say today, this is the rule. But yesterday it was something different, and that's been wiped because the government hasn't got space, let's say, to keep track of everything that's been taking place. I know I'm the voice of doom and gloom, or maybe we both are. I hope not. We'll have something more cheery to say on scenario 4. But be aware of termination rights, because most FIDIC contracts, in fact, most contracts stop, will provide for termination for prolonged force majeure, either where there is a force majeure event in place for a particular period, or where there is force majeure event in place for a sort of aggregate period of time, even if it stops and starts. And it's important to remember that this is actually a right that's afforded to both owner and contractor. So it's not simply a case, for example, of an owner thinking, should I terminate or shouldn't I? You could actually be on the receiving end of a termination claim. And again, really important where you have finance on board, you need to make sure that you understand your rights and what that might trigger under your suite of finance agreements. But also think about the rest of your contractual suite. So, for example, a PPA. I've had a scenario where there was a PPA and it wasn't back to back with the main contract. The force majeure provisions weren't back to back. And so what situation that could have arisen is that there could have been a termination event under the main contract, which would not trigger a termination event under the PPA, and which would have left the owner exposed to a huge amount of liability under the PPA. So again, it's best to get that right at the outset if you can. But if you can't, it's important to understand the commercial landscape that you're operating in, because again, it might lead you to think more creatively about what solutions you need to put in place in order to avoid that type of situation. Collaboration, we've said a lot about it, but just I hope the messages that comes out of this session is it may well be the best thing. Even though it might feel like you're giving something away or you're compromising, it may well be the best option, particularly if you want to keep a project afloat. And in an international project like this, you'll need to take advice in local jurisdictions, because the governing law of the contract and the location of the site will determine certain issues, but there'll also be, for example, the law relevant to your design office, or where the component parts are being manufactured, or how they're being transferred, and they also need to be considered. And I know, Damian, a particular hobby horse, obviously, of yours in relation to costs and quantum.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's very interesting regarding costs and quantum, particularly when you're pursuing changing law claims. But disruption is going to be the biggest impact, actually, on construction projects, not necessarily prolongation. Now, we know that disruption on the critical path will lead to prolongation of the works. But ultimately, from a cost perspective, a lot of the projects, certainly that I've been looking at, haven't had that many complete standstills. But what they have had is a lot of restrictions in terms of their working, numbers of men, labour force issues. So a lot of the claims that are starting to come through are disruption claims. And I think we all know that disruption claims are extremely hard to advance correctly. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't try, and we'll need to, because ultimately that's where the entitlement will be, on the disruption perspective. And we're not talking just about disruption on site, we're talking about disruption in fabrication yards and in design offices as well. How do we impact and assess, things like social distancing on working or working hours? I was talking to someone the other day and they said, well, as an example, it sounds a crazy sort of example, that it took them a lot longer to get a coffee break, because they had to social distance in the queue for the coffee machine, and therefore they couldn't. It cost them 10 minutes instead of 5. So there's a very simple example of a disruption due to COVID. But that's kind of you can magnify that out into how you're going to actually assess that. I mean, there is only one really recognised method, certainly method recognised by the courts in England, which is the measured mile analysis. But it's not easy to develop a measured mile analysis accurately. You've got to obviously establish a period of labour productivity that was unimpacted, and it has to be a reasonably good sample, and commensurate with the activities that are disrupted, of course. And there's a benefit to it because it's based on actual data. It doesn't rely on planned outputs, but you can imagine that it's going to come down to records, unfortunately. From my experience, it's often the case that contractors do have records of the man hours spent, obviously, but they don't have the detail of the hours that were spent in respect to particular activities. So the detail is not there. The daily allocation sheets are not really detailed enough. They're not resource coded. They're too general. And then when you're trying to apply some form of analysis, comparing the disrupted activities with the program, for example, it's very, very difficult to do well. So, I'm hoping that contractors have learned a lot from what's been going on, and that they may be thinking about bolstering their commercial resources on projects when they're aware that disruption claims are likely to be advanced, because once the events have happened and the horse is bolted out of the stable, then you are where you are with the records. So it's really important that you basically focus on making sure that the records are accurate and detailed. Another aspect of the disruption claim which needs to be thought about as well is the abatement for other issues, because obviously this topic is about global claims for the entire period and the associated cost. But the reality is that there will be other events that disrupt works on site and delay works on site that are not COVID related, and there will be weather, downtime, plant breakdown, strikes, whatever, you name it. So it's very important when you do a disruption analysis, that you are focused on the COVID impact, and to look at the actual outputs before and the actual outputs afterwards from a COVID perspective. And just sort of one last point on this, obviously it's important to focus and remember that a COVID issue may not result in a critical delay. You've always got to be mindful of the critical path through your project and the delays that occur to the critical path. I am seeing situations where claims are being pursued on a COVID basis, but the focus is not there. It's looking at activities where there's a lot of float on the programme, and that's where the focus is. And maybe, yes, there's been impact of COVID, and maybe that will result in a cost claim for disruption, but it will not entitle the contractor to secure an extension of time, because it just hasn't impacted on the critical path the way the contractor is alluding to in his claim. So maybe I've been rambling on a bit there on my favourite topic, but there's lots to think about from a disruption perspective, that's for sure.
Agreed. Okay, so looking at the time, we'll skip on to scenario 4, shall we, Damian?
Yeah. Okay, so the owners are considering building another wind farm. What should the contractor employee be aware of, and what should the parties do next?
This is possibly the most interesting scenario. There's a reason why we left it to the end, because it means you had to have listened to us for the previous 3. There's a huge amount to include in this question, and clearly we can't cover it all. So what we want to do is just give you some food for thought, and I'm sure most of you have been thinking about it in any event. But do come, if you've got specific queries after the seminar, then please do reach out to us, and we're happy to go through it with you in more detail. In the post-COVID era, or maybe we're not quite post, but we're getting there. There are a huge amount of issues to be considered, and I think it's fair to say that as a general point, more due diligence will need to be required in order to interrogate a particular jurisdiction, in order to interrogate the particular project of choice, the general political and economic climate and any restrictions in place, the appetite and support of lenders, which we've seen sort of doing this, and really important, the creditworthiness of the supply chain, among various others. But of course, contract is king, and that deserves the most attention. And I would recommend that if you haven't done already, there is an audit of any standard contracts. By standard, I don't mean bespoke, but I mean if you're used to using FIDIC Yellow Book or FIDIC Silver Book, for example, with your own in-house amendments, you need to review those contracts, and you need to pay careful attention to the contract draft, and in particular provisions like force majeure, change in law, health and safety provisions, personnel provisions. And I saw a question pop up in the chat box, which basically said, do we anticipate that going forward we'll see the usual terms change because of COVID-19? And the answer to that is absolutely, and it's already happening. So we're already signing contracts that have got specific COVID-19 clauses in. So there's various different ways that you can do it. Some parties are choosing to amend and relook at a force majeure provision, for example. Others are choosing to actually put in a COVID-19 clause. What I will say as a general point is the more granular you can make it, the better. So leaving things open to interpretation is always risky in this contract, because us lawyers like to come in and claim that there are various different ways you can interpret it. But obviously employers and contractors are taking slightly different stances depending on what they want. But most actually are requesting that COVID is carved out of the force majeure provisions and is dealt with separately on its own regime. Obviously contractors need to protect themselves from ongoing disruption, because we don't know what, when this is going to end or whether or not it'll come back. We also don't know if there'll be COVID-20 and COVID-21 or an entirely new virus. I think it's definitely on everybody's radar now that it poses one of the biggest threats to society and business generally. There's also questions to be asked about the extent to which you price in that risk, or whether or not you don't price it in, but you leave it open to a contractor to have the right to claim. What you need to be very careful of is a double whammy, whereby it's priced in and they have the ability to then claim for additional time and money. And sometimes in contracts, you'll actually see it expressly written out that there has been an amount allowed for in the programme or in the cost, and that there is a specific regime available in the event that there is further disruption. And what we're actually doing for certain clients as well is drafting an alternative performance regime. So that in the event of there being further disruption, the blades, for example, actually be dealt with or attempted to be dealt with up front in terms of, for example, allocating a particular percentage of goods by contract to that project in the event of disruption. So there's a huge amount we can do, but a lot of it's quite bespoke, so I won't go into too much detail. Damian, perhaps you can talk about the... Yeah,
I just wanted to add a couple of points on that, which was the back-to-back arrangements, really, because as I said earlier, we've not really given much thought to changing law provisions in the past. It's not a provision that we really spend much time on. We're doing contract reviews and looking at risk. It's a key issue now, and it may well be in the future. And I have sort of been involved in situations the last year or so where the back-to-back arrangements just don't work. And, we have situations where, for example, a subcontractor may have a very wide change in law provision, but the main contract change in law provision is actually quite narrow, and it may well be limited to site or in country, which doesn't really work on an international project. And therefore, the main contractor could be left holding the baby in that situation where the subcontractor has the entitlement under the subcontract, and unfortunately, the main contractor is not able to pass that on because of the differences between the contracts. So I think your point's absolutely valid that we do need to review all the contracts, but we need to look at not just the main contract, but we need to look at the supply agreements, third party interface obligations and everything really to make sure it's fit for purpose.
Absolutely, and have a look at the dispute resolution provisions as well, because it's everybody now seems to adopt this multi-tiered approach to dispute resolution, meaning that parties have to jump through several hoops, usually quite expensive hoops, before they receive any sort of binding decision. But what the pandemic has shown us is that in a true crisis situation, during the operational phase of the project, for example, falling out with each other has not helped. It doesn't help, and that actually there's been a move towards more of a collaborative contracting approach that obviously we've seen in other jurisdictions already. And certainly in, for example, the 2017 FIDIC suite, we've already seen, as we call it, that FIDIC is starting to borrow the clothes of NEC. But I certainly think that we'll start to see more movement in that regard following the pandemic. But having said all of that and having banged this drum about collaboration, just another reminder, I suppose, that you still need to protect your position. So we're not saying this does away with claims, and certainly shouldn't be rolling over and waiving everything left, right and centre. So just because you're in crisis, don't forget about your legal rights and remedies. But certainly I think personally we'll see a move away from perhaps a more really complex dispute resolution process, and maybe some specific and bespoke DR processes that are drafted in to enable to get together and resolve quickly and more efficiently.
No, I agree. I mean, certainly from FIDIC, as you say, with DAB now, DAB provisions, is that going to become more popular? I don't know, if I'm honest. I mean, my experience of sort of standing DABs is that they really haven't been put in place on projects of less than 500 million. I mean, certainly I've been acting as client rep on a few DABs over the years, and it tends to be that kind of level because a standing DAB is quite expensive. You've got regular site visits, 3 months, 6 months, and then you've then got, the actual disputes themselves that have to be dealt with. It's great in some respects because you're getting through the disputes relatively quickly, but it is an expensive process. So is that going to be taken on board? I don't know. Is there going to be a streamlined version? Who knows? The choice of panel members as well is obviously a controversial topic because, I have been involved in DABs where there's been a panel of three eminent lawyers like yourself, Anna, or, QCs, barristers, retired High Court judges, etc. And you can see how that happens because one party will propose a senior lawyer for their side, and the other side, almost fighting fire with fire, would also propose a lawyer, and then those two would then appoint a third party DAB member who will also inevitably be a senior lawyer. Is that a good thing? I mean, certainly you need someone on the panel who has got a really good grasp of the law because you don't want a bad decision. So you need a good understanding of the applicable law and the contract. You need the confidence. The parties need the confidence of that individual. But what about technical issues? What about commercial issues? Are three lawyers is that the right mix?
Very rarely, Damian, very rarely.
So, and ultimately as well, we mustn't forget that it's a temporarily binding process. It's not finally binding. And therefore, if you have three lawyers, are you going to end up with a mini arbitration or even a full-blown arbitration process? And then to follow that with an arbitration process afterwards, because one side is not happy with the DAB. So it's interesting, isn't it?
It is, and that's my experience that it can, unless it's properly controlled, generally by the lawyers, it can turn into a mini arbitration. But you'll also be glad to know, Damian, that actually on a recent power dispute based in Africa, we have actually proposed that there shouldn't be three lawyers on the panel, and that there should in fact be an expert on board. So I'll let you know how we get on with that. And final point, we've been watching the chat box. There doesn't appear to be too much in. I will try and leave a couple of minutes if anyone wants to add anything. But I would just say, and I think Damian, you'd echo this, that the key is to plan for future disruption actually. Because at the moment it's very unclear when we're going to be free of COVID-19, and obviously some jurisdictions such as India are facing a huge challenge, and others maybe, as we have started to see, facing a third wave. So we're definitely not out of the woods yet. For international people operating in international projects, it's very important to remember that. So plan, I think is the message to leave you with, and consider what steps you can take within your own organisations and project setup to increase the resilience and contingencies in place, and perhaps start thinking about what plan B or plan C might look like, and have it up your sleeve so that if the inevitable happens, then you're not thinking standing start and having to pull everybody together and do that brainstorming off at the board level. You've actually got those ideas ready to roll out in what can be a very difficult and distressing time.
Yeah, I would totally echo that, Anna. I can't quite see the chat feed at the moment, so I don't know whether if there's anything on there that we could cover now, or whether we just would wrap it up.
There's just one popped in. Hang on a second. One for you, Damian. You mentioned in scenario 2 a third-party external verifier for contract or financial oversight. Is this common? Have you employed this? This obviously needs it's costing into the project as an additional cost and some stakeholders to sign off on it.
Yeah, we have done that. We've been involved in that process. We have done it. As you say, it needs sign off. It needs stakeholder involvement. But it has been beneficial. I mean, I might say that. I probably would say that, having been involved, but I believe it was a benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I've got experience of it as well, and it has been. And yes, it does need stakeholder buy-in and sign off, etc. But in certain circumstances, I think it can work very well. I know it's 1,400 hours. I've also seen that Suba has also said, "Are we aware of any cases in the court on these issues? And if not, when do you think they will come through?" Perhaps if I go first on that one, we have started to see some related issues, let's say. There are also arbitral proceedings underway already, which obviously, unfortunately, we don't get to hear as much about. So they are starting to come now, and I would expect that to continue for the next few years, actually. So I think there's actually been a lull because people didn't know where they were going to come out of all of this and whether or not there would be a second wave and a third wave. Now that that has happened, you'll see some projects that have managed to collaborate and recover, and I think they probably won't ever end up in a claim scenario. You'll see others which are starting to come to fruition now and will do so over the next few years. Damian, I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't seen, I mean, so far just adjudications for me, where it's to start to come through, and on the larger claims, larger projects, they're still in the kind of negotiation phase. And they may well be in the negotiation phase for some time to come. That's the way. It's quite challenging for sure.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, we're 1 minute over, so thank you very much indeed for bearing with us. And please do contact either me or Damian if you have any questions or want any follow-up. But it's been a real delight to speak to you all today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Anna.